Hello, everyone. Welcome into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Monday, October 21st around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start with that drubbing that happened in Austin, Texas this past weekend. Georgia went to work and planted their flag right back in the top of the SEC. So we'll break it down on today's show in the first segment. We'll also get into the officiating in that game. Not very good. I'll leave it at that for the time being. Then we'll get into a couple of different games in the top 10. Tennessee gets a huge win over Alabama at home. Second time in a row they've won that game in Knoxville. And then you had Miami win an absolute shootout against Louisville that was a little bit indicative of what Miami is this season. Then we'll get into a couple of statement teams, LSU, Indiana, Illinois, among a couple others that really made some noise this past weekend and kind of made a little bit of a statement moving forward. Then we'll get into the top 25. We have a ton of results going all the way back to Friday. Honestly, kind of forgot about that Oregon game just a little bit when I was preparing for the show, but we'll get into that along with all the other top 25 games, and then we'll just get into a little bit of a whip around. A ton of games that we haven't had a chance to get to throughout the first part of the show, we'll get into at the end, including that just drubbing South Carolina gave to Oklahoma this past weekend. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use that tip and donation link, or to use that super chat, kind of went back to my old script there, but use the super chat at the bottom of the Sports Network chat. That little $sign, add a question, comment you'd like. Your name will pop up on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be interactive as we head to the end of the season, and there's quite a few questions. No two ways about that, so definitely utilize that if you'd like to. And also, the gsmcpodcast.net page is still up and running if you'd like to use that. It does the exact same thing. So either one of those you'd like to use, definitely do. Make this a little bit more interactive, but we got to jump into this first one because Georgia went to work. There's no two ways about that. It was absolute domination pretty much from start to finish. Texas did a little bit to kind of come back in this game late in it, but at the end of the day, Georgia gets a win 30-15, really kind of plants their flag as they're not the Georgia team that a lot of us thought they were going into this game, including myself, to be totally honest with you, and they were all over the place. And I promise you, we will get to the craziness around the officiating here in a second, but I wanted to give some love to Georgia here before we got into all of that craziness. Kirby Smart and Glenn Schumann just outright won this game. I don't think there's any two ways about it. They absolutely dominated Texas from start to finish. There were so many different examples of where Kirby just had the right play call, whether it was the Dalen Everett forced fumble where he came off the edge at the perfect time, or it was the incredible call on the fourth down stop that Texas could have definitely gotten back into it, but Quinn Ewers was under pressure pretty much from the jump, had to release the ball. Ryan Wingo catches it on a knee. So it's a huge difference in this game that Kirby Smart and Glenn Schumann just did an incredible job just scheming up and getting all these guys into really bad situations, including Quinn Ewers and then Arch Manning when he did come into that game. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But overall, the quarterback stats are rather confusing in this one. Quinn Ewers had more yards. Beck had 3 interceptions. Ewers did have 3 turnovers, 2 fumbles, 1 pick, but at the end of the day, the Georgia defense won this game, and there's no two ways about that. In fact, during that entire game, Georgia had 6 scoring drives. They started on the Texas 13, 28, 30, 34, and then their own 45, the final drive was very long, much longer, or in the first half, I've kind of lost my train of thought here. UGA had 6 scoring drives in this game. Only one of them eclipsed more than 35 yards. In the first half alone, they got the ball on the Texas 13, 28, 30, 34, and then their own 45 was the worst field position they got in that half. Just absolutely, the Texas offense continuously hurt that defense, and frankly, the Texas defense played pretty good ball. It's very hard to be very angry at the Texas defense after that game because 30 points was a lot of it was just this Texas defense being put in terrible positions by this offense, and a lot of it was this pass rush was all over the place. Some of it was Quinn Ewers did a very bad job of helping out his offensive line at different moments. There was one sack in particular by Jalen Walker, I believe, near the goal line where he had a clean pocket to step up into, probably could have hit a big gain on that play. He didn't, and he missed that one. And a lot of this is something that probably shouldn't be happening to a third-year starter, and that's a big-time issue. It's one of the reasons he was taken out, and frankly, if you have a third-year starter that's getting rattled to the point where he's getting taken out of the game, you have some issues on your hands. No two ways about that. They're fixable issues. When you look back at this tape, I think Quinn Ewers is going to be able to say, yeah, I should have stepped up there, and I think his mental clock will be a little bit better when they go play Vanderbilt this upcoming weekend. But the reality is, he got absolutely terrorized and did not respond well. And Sark didn't necessarily respond well either, so they got a lot to figure out. And overall, we can talk about the offensive line. They got eaten for dinner. No two ways about that. But not nearly as much of this was on the offensive line as we probably thought. I mean, only 2 of the sacks were attributed to the blockers on this team. During this game, there were 7 sacks. So a couple of them were at least on the quarterback. A couple of them, like that Dalen Everett forced fumble, was just scheme-based. It was just Glenn Schumann and Kirby Smart going to work and absolutely dominating the day. And those 2 guys right there on the Georgia jerseys were a big part of that. And Jalen Walker, he made a lot of money on Saturday. I can promise you that. Jalen Walker had 8 tackles, 3 sacks, a fumble recovery. Michael Williams had 2 sacks and a forced fumble. And Dalen Everett played the best football I've ever seen him play in a Georgia jersey, a forced fumble and an INT. He was all over the place, was absolutely remarkable in this game. And overall, the entire defensive front just went to absolute work. But getting to a little bit of the issues with Texas and kind of here, let me go back here for a second. Getting to the issues in the quarterback position, because obviously Arch Manning did come into this game. Steve Sarkisian said after the game, Quinn Ewers is their starter, no doubt about it. He just needed to catch his breath a little bit, get a little bit his feet under him, and in the second half, played a lot better football. No two ways about that. Didn't play perfect by any means, but at the end of the day, played a lot more clean, played a lot more confident. If he played that way from the jump, I think Texas has a much better shot in this game. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of issues there. You have to be able to be, as a third-year starter, walk into a moment like this and not flinch. That's the biggest thing that Quinn Ewers has been able to do in the past part of his career. Shows up in these big-time games like Alabama, like Washington a year ago. Didn't play a perfect game, but definitely played some really good football there. And overall, he's been built for these moments in a number of different ways. It didn't show on Saturday by any means. So he's got a lot to figure out, no two ways about that. I tend to believe he's more than fine. I think that injury's bothering him just a little bit, but at the end of the day, you're good enough to be out there, you're good enough to play well. That's just the reality of the situation, and he's got a lot to figure out. If he, plays incredibly against Vanderbilt, all of this will be gone by the wayside, I can promise you that. But as of right now, I think he has quite a few questions to answer in this week's work, in this week's practice, and we'll see how he comes out against Vanderbilt. But as of right now, I don't think as a Texas fan you can feel super confident in what Quinn Ewers is giving you. I think he will be more than fine. I think you will feel confident going forward. On Saturday, he showed some issues that we hadn't seen in a couple of years, and that's definitely very worrisome. But moving forward to a couple of different things in this game, and the Georgia offense didn't necessarily play their best football. They did get the run game going, which was absolutely huge. If you see that Trevor Etienne the rest of the year, this is going to be a team that's going to be really hard to deal with. And obviously, the couple of picks from Carson Beck were an absolute problem. He's got to figure out what goes on in away games because he does get ahead of himself quite a bit. I think the first pick itself was just Andrew Makuba making a ridiculous play, but the other two were definitely an issue, and one we'll get into right now because that was the big talking point coming out of this game, and it probably should have been that Georgia was just absolutely incredible. The game plan and all of that stuff probably should have been at the forefront, but then some fans decided to throw some trash on the field. So the officiating, let's just start with this. It was absolutely offensive pass interference. I don't think people are necessarily disagreeing with that at this point. It's just the reality of the situation. Arian Smith definitely pushed off. They definitely got the call wrong initially, and they got it right after the fact. You cannot change it in that context. I don't even care if the guy comes into the huddle and says, I got it wrong, we have to be able to change it here. You can't. You just can't. The second that a bottle is thrown on that field, you have to make the conscious decision that you are not going to give in to that type of stuff. And you are not going to essentially reward that type of stuff because Texas has gotten their fine. Some fans are getting, their season tickets taken away, which they probably should. And congratulations, I hope it was worth it. But at the end of the day, you very much cannot give them that. You very much cannot encourage this behavior going forward, and that's exactly what the refs did. Now, I'm not here to tell you that the SEC called it in or anything like that because I think that's outright ridiculous. I just think these refs made the wrong call, period, end of story. I think they decided that they made the wrong call initially. I'm not necessarily saying they made the wrong call overall. I do think it was offensive pass interference. The reality is, the second that those fans start throwing bottles, you have to make the conscious decision that we can't give them this one. We have to just get this one wrong, take the lickings for getting the PI wrong, and then move forward with our day. That's just the reality of the situation. So that's a terrible, terrible thing that happened. No two ways about that. Texas has been punished, but the damage has been done in large part. There were a couple of targeting calls as well. More than anything, we just got to look at targeting as a whole. I don't think it's necessarily either of those calls were outright egregious. I also think neither of those calls were very aggressive and should have been, the targeting that we're trying to get out of the sport. But moving forward, I mean, obviously, we'll talk about this plenty over the next couple of days, and everyone will over the next couple of days. But how Georgia was able to win this game. The defensive game plan was absolutely incredible. 7 sacks, 10 tackles for loss, 28 total pressures, and I told you earlier, the blockers on those were only attributed 11 pressures and 2 sacks by PFF. So a lot of those were scheme-based. A lot of those were quarterback-based. So a lot of things to figure out if you're a Texas offense. But at the end of the day, the offensive line got eaten up. No two ways about that. The run game, I believe they averaged 1.1 yards per carry, and I think it was even less than that. I think ESPN did them a little bit of a favor by rounding up to 1.1 instead of 1. But at the end of the day, it was absolute domination. It started with Kirby Smart and Glenn Schumann, and then they used the noise. You could tell it by Kirby Smart's post-game interview, although he went after ESPN and the refs just a little bit there. He used the energy, the noise that everyone was picking Texas, including myself, was picking Texas in this game, and they questioned the defense of this Georgia team. They questioned the ability outright of this Georgia team, and Kirby Smart just went out there and showed them. And this is the superpower of Kirby Smart that he got from Nick Saban. The ability to keep these guys intact. The ability to say, no one believes in you. You're the number 5 team in the country. There's plenty of people that believe in you. But you have to get them to believe that. Because at the end of the day, they walk out there with their hair on fire, and you see what happens. It was absolute domination from start to finish. And then finally, responding. Regardless of how you feel about the officiating, whether you think it was the right call, wrong call, whether they should have given Texas the pick or not, I'm very much on the side of the second that they throw bottles on the field, you cannot give them that call. But at the end of the day, Georgia was able to respond pretty much every which way from Tuesday. There were a number of different calls. There were a number of different moments where Georgia could have said, man, nothing's going our way, could have kind of folded in just a little bit, but they kept moving. And especially that 89-yard drive, the only scoring drive that was over 35 yards for for Georgia in that game, came at the very biggest moment. And a couple of huge play calls by Mike Bobo where I think a lot of Georgia fans were expecting him to make not great play calls. He made a couple of incredible ones. They went down the field, scored a touchdown, and put this game away. So not enough can be said about this Georgia coaching staff getting these guys ready, and they came in and did what a championship team does. They tear a team to pieces that no one expects them to beat, and at the end of the day, they move forward as maybe one of the title favorites after a lot of questions around this team. But where they move forward from here, I think for Texas, a lot to figure out. No two ways about that. I think there's one of those things that you came out really, really flat, didn't necessarily have a good counterpunch to what Georgia was throwing at you, and at the end of the day, did not play good football. Period. End of story. All that being said, your defense played really, really well. Your defense gave you every single chance you possibly could have wanted to win this game. You have to fix up a couple of things on your offense. You have to be able to get Quinn Ewers more comfortable stepping up into the pocket and making those throws. And frankly, he's done that earlier in the year. We saw it in the Michigan game. That was probably the biggest thing I took away from that was his pocket mobility has taken a big time step forward. It didn't on Saturday, and it has to be able to show going forward, or they're going to get eaten up the exact same way with guys just going all-out pressure on him and Quinn Ewers getting a little bit flustered. But at the end of the day, all the goals are still ahead of them. You win out, you're definitely in the CFP. You're probably on your way to Atlanta for an SEC title and maybe a rematch with this team. So everything is still ahead of them. Obviously, in the 12-team playoff, it's much less about that one loss you take. It's much more about the way you bounce back. A big one against Vandy, which is now a ranked matchup, which we'll get into here in a minute. But at the end of the day, everything's still ahead of Texas, but quite a few things to figure out, especially at that quarterback and offensive line positions. And then for Georgia, if this is the team you get, if this is the D-line you get when you're healthy and attacking, call it. This is going to be a dominant defense. They are going to attack people from start to finish. If Dalen Everett starts to take his game to the next level, it's going to be a nightmare for just about anyone they play. Now, the big-time thing here is Carson Beck just has to play better on the road. There's no way they're going to be able to win a national title with Carson Beck if he cannot walk into opposing stadiums and get a big-time win. Period. End of story. They got a big one against Ole Miss going forward. I don't think Ole Miss is going to hand you all of the things that Texas did. I don't want to say hand you. Georgia earned pretty much everything they got on Saturday. I'm just saying in general, you're probably not going to get the number of mistakes that you got from Texas, from Ole Miss in that game. You got to be able to cause havoc, and frankly, this is a game that Georgia needed. They needed to prove to everyone that they are still the Georgia Bulldogs. They are still the team that you're going to have to deal with when you go through the SEC, and they're probably still the class of the SEC. They're not at the top right now. Obviously, that's A&M and LSU, and we'll talk about that game later in the week, but at the end of the day, this is one of those teams that whenever you count them out, you probably shouldn't have. Frankly, I made that pick with Texas on Thursday. I picked them to win. Then I saw a lot of people start picking Texas, and you started to get closer to game time, and you thought, Georgia's probably going to win this game, but they won it in dominating fashion. Incredible win from them, and they move forward with everything intact and probably the second or third betting favorite to win the national title right about now. I didn't check it, but have to assume they're very much towards the top. But let's take our first break. Went a little bit long there. Let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we got to talk about Tennessee and Miami. Tennessee wins a rock fight. Miami wins a shootout, but they both find themselves in a very, very good place for the CFP. So we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.